So, hi, my name is Lorraine of Satori Space, and I have got the absolute pleasure of having a conversation today with Vince Shubert. How are you, Vince?
I'm good, thank you.
Always good. So, just for a little bit of a pre-frame for this conversation, the conversation is around awakening and what that means, and why there's such a I don't know, I guess a movement, if you can call it that, with people wanting to wake up at the minute. I'm sure the internet helps us with that. But I met you, Vince, because I had that interest myself. And I was going through a YouTube channel called the Awakening Curriculum. And I'd heard Pranilla many times throughout a lot of those interviews for people to say, if you're interested in this and exploring it directly for yourself, go to Vince's group. And she kept saying, go to Vince's group, go to Vince's group. And I was like, well, who is this Vince? And where do I find Vince? And where can I get this group? And I went Googling and searching on some of her YouTube channels. And of course, I found your group. And I joined that group not knowing anything, really. I was just like, I'm interested in this. I feel a drawing, I feel a pull. And I just found it was a really nice container for people to explore, I guess, their definition of reality on where, because that's what we're looking at, right? It's the fundamentals of who we are as beings and identity and what that reality looks like. So that's enough of the intro. I'll talk about the group again later. But Vince, you really hold space in that group. I was there last week and you reminded everyone who was chatting away that the only thing we have is here and now. What is going on for us here and now in this moment? And that can help us on this awakening journey, if you like, if we can call it that. But Vince, just to start this conversation off, what is your definition of awakening?
Okay.
Start with
Yeah,
the big
that's a
guns.
good one. Yeah, the big guns. Well, definition. You're asking for definition or to describe something called awakening. I mean, back when we were seekers, it was seen to be a spiritual path. But these days, I see it as becoming more human, or rather, revealing the humanity underneath the conditioning that we grow up with, the conditioning of how we should be, who we should be, what we should do, all of that stuff that society imposes on us one way or another. If we can recognize that they are conceptual overlays on reality, then we're not compelled to automatically be obedient to them. We may still choose to go along with them, but it's more of a choice. But choice, of course, yes, let's not get into that at the moment. But yeah, so awakening is a human being that is aware of what is actual. And what is actual, the only thing that is actual, is your current experiencing. And even that is an interpretation. So removing the necessity to be someone. Well, we talk about in this path, we talk about recognizing that there's not an actual self running the show, and that therefore that foundation for control and choice and decisions, etc., isn't there. So awakening is recognizing those things, but recognizing them not just at an intellectual level, but rather at a level of experience. Now I've said all of that, it doesn't sound like much of a definition, but yeah,
No, I think it is.
we can expand on it.
There's a few key points in there around, awakening, can be seen to be awakening into who you really are beyond the concepts that you mentioned.
yeah,
And you also mentioned becoming aware at an experiential level that you are not your thoughts.
yeah,
And,
very much so. Yeah,
and when you realize that and you can sort of step back a bit, I guess in an entry level, it's about becoming the watcher. You can be the watcher of those thoughts and realize that they're popping into your head.
yeah, yeah. And that's how most of our conditioning is expressed as thoughts that impose ways to be. So by one of the big things that happens with people that wake up is that in the beginning especially is the recognition that our thoughts are not us and that we don't have to obey what our thoughts say. But if there's an inclination to obey what our thoughts say, then that is there for a reason. That happened for a reason, and we can investigate that reason and become free of the necessity to be obedient to what the thoughts say. So it's our thoughts that cause most of, probably all of our suffering comes from the way we think.
And I think that, Vince, you helped me directly through LU, Liberation Unleashed, doing some direct pointing for me, which was obviously fundamental for me. Um, but it didn't, that awakening to, who you are and you're not your thoughts. If I'm not my thoughts and I'm not this identity, then who I am, it can be quite a big shift in somebody's perspective of who they are. It can be a big shift. But for me, that didn't happen all at once. For me, that happened over, it started a few months ago and then it went away and then it came back. And then it was over a few days. It's another insight and another insight and another insight. And then you sort of laugh at the hilarity or the absurdity that a human being could have anything,
Mm.
or just things like that. But for me, that happened over a period of time. So
Yes, yeah.
how did that happen for you, Vince? How did
It
that happen?
happened. Well, that's a tricky one. I would say most of the people I've guiding, it would happen like that, like you said. So not many people have a giant epiphany and come out the other side awake.
Mm.
Or those that do usually get visited by doubts sometime after that and go through it again. So it's worth emphasizing that this is a journey that never ends. Right? So that those little shifts that happen as we realize things will continue for a long time. They get further and further apart, but they get more and more subtle as well. So they continue there. Now that you've mentioned Liberation Unleashed, it's worth mentioning that has been a big part of my life. So after I woke up, I discovered Liberation Unleashed. Um, and when they accepted that I had a shift, I started guiding almost immediately there, and that was now 14 years ago. So I've guided a lot of people over that time. The terminology they use is through the gate. They call it a gateless gate. But as a seeker, it's a gate. Once somebody wakes up, it's seen to be a gateless gate. So we also recognise that once we wake up, that there's no such thing as waking up. But that's another story.
Yeah.
Uh,
We come back to some direct pointing.
yeah.
But I did hear you talk about your journey before, Vince, and it was a wee. Can, sorry, I probably interrupted you there. Could you just go back and share us a little bit what that was like for you?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. No, I'd actually forgotten what I was talking about there. Yeah.
All
Um,
right.
right. So I did have a somewhat abrupt waking up in 2011. But I need to say that I was a seeker, a searcher for well over 45 years before that time. So I read everything and I was obsessive looking to get enlightened from when I was 20 was really active. I started being active, and I'm sure before that there was the dissatisfaction with life that caused that to culminate at 20. But at 20, I started actually looking and doing things to try and get enlightened. And it wasn't until I was 65. And at 65, excuse me, at 65, I had an epiphany. And it was when I was speaking to a man in America. Um, I discovered him on the internet, and he charged me $50 to talk to him for an hour. And as he was talking to me, he said to me, he said, Vince, the mosquito bite of seeking is never going to heal while you keep scratching it. And that just blew my mind. I just went, of course, of course. How can I be awake and be a seeker at the same time? I have to drop this identity as a seeker in order to be awake. And then I went, I've got goosebumps now as I talk about it. Then I went, well, that means that whatever is whatever is, and this is it. And there was just no escape from the inevitability that if I'm going to look for something in the future, I'm just creating something out of nothing. I'm just playing with a story. And it's never going to happen while ever I look for it in the future. It's now. It's here. This is it. And all of a sudden, this didn't seem so mundane. This wasn't painful. This was actually pretty magical at that moment. And so I went around saying, this is it for quite a while after that. Yeah. But that changed my life. That, 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 that it was, it wasn't until I went to Liberation Unleashed, which was quite soon after that. And although I didn't realize it at the time, Liberation Unleashed had only really just got going as well. But they asked me about the self. Is there a self there running the show? And it was straight away, I never even thought about it before then, but it was straight away really obvious that all there was that constituted a self was stories I had about Vince. Stories. I had a book full of stories from when I was really young. I had 65 years of stories accumulated about my likes and dislikes and how I looked and how other people related to me, what other people thought of me, what I thought of everything else, how the world should be. There's just no end to the stories that I had. And I also recognised somewhere, I don't know if it was at that time, but anyway, somewhere I recognised that the sense of self, not there was no actual self, there was just these stories, but the sense of self was me responding to those stories, me reacting to them, how I felt about things when one of those stories got activated. And that was my sense of self. And I also got asked at Liberation Unleashed, and this was a really big one for me because it really focused me in a much deeper way to what was going on. And that was they asked me whether in experiencing, is there an experiencer experiencing a thing? And it became, once again, it was really obvious to me that I had to stop experiencing in order to think about an experiencer or what was being experienced. So consequently, it was obvious that there was only actual experiencing going on. There was no experiencer. That was just a mental concept. And I couldn't have that mental concept while I was experiencing. And the same thing about whatever object was being experienced or whatever conditions were being experienced, that they could only be a mental construct. Experiencing was my actual reality. That was it.
That was very
Even
well.
though,
On you
sorry,
go. On you go, sorry. Even though?
even though what I was experiencing was my interpretation of whatever it was. And along with that experiencing was the recognition that when I became aware of what I was experiencing, what I was actually aware of was a memory of experience because it happened half a second ago. The experience was done and dusted. And the really, really big thing was, how crazy is it to want something that's finished to be different? It's done and dusted. So any idea about it being different is bound to produce suffering or adding to reality. Yeah,
That
it
was
was a
very
big
well
one.
articulated, Vince. It was very well articulated there. There's a bit of tongue twisters in there as well with the experiencing and an experiencer, but it was really well articulated. A lot of the stuff that we read around this, or even the Buddha said, mind is suffering. And that mental construct, again, as you say, wishing anything can be different as it is crazy because it's in the
Yeah.
past. Whatever's
And that's
happened,
where suffering comes in.
and whatever is happening, physically, there's a body sensation, whatnot, seconds before we actually see the thought or experience it anyway.
Mm,
um,
exactly, yeah.
interesting. Um, and I think those fundamental questions can be really challenging for someone starting out on that journey. Like, what do you mean this is just stories?
Mm,
I am going to do this in the future. This is fact.
yeah.
And we believe that because we've been taught to believe that. So it's really challenging to try and shift that.
It's even a bit more fundamental. I mean, that's easy to see how I'm going to do something in the future as a story. But if you're walking along a path and you get uh, uh, an impression of a great big glob of green sitting on a brown stick on the ground in front of you, your brain immediately says tree. Now, here's the trick. Depending on your intention, but if you're not going to go up and interact with that tree, you will think that you're walking past a tree, but you're not. You're actually walking past your idea of a tree. And it's your idea of what goes on in the world that most people relate to. It's not the actual thing. It's not an actual other person that you're having a relationship with when you're talking to somebody. It is your idea of them that
Yeah.
you've put out, you've projected out there, and that's what you're relating to. That's concept. That's not actual. So if you were to go up to that tree and put your fingers on the branch of the trunk of the tree, you could say, I'm touching the trunk. That's conceptual as well. What is actually happening is these things we call fingers are experiencing a sensation of this thing we call a trunk. But the actual thing, the actuality of it, is that there's only sensation. There's no trunk, that's a concept. There's no fingers, that's a concept. There's no me, that's a concept. There's no tree, that's a concept. So this is a lot harder to get your mind around because what it means is that most people go through life relating to ideas that they've put out there, not to what is actual. So those who have woken up have a much more likely to, and I'm not saying it would happen 100%, but much more likely to recognize what is actual as compared to what is conceptual, what is the idea.
And that can only come through the sensory experiences. there's the senses. The senses are how you are perceiving the now. Would that be right?
Yes.
And thought is also another sensation. It's coming in,
Yes.
it's appearing.
Yeah. So there
And
is the sensation of an actual thought turning up, but what that thought is about is pure fantasy. But there's a twist here, and that is that without the fantasy, there's no thought. We can experience the fact of a thought, but what the thought is about is just fantasy. It's a concept. It's not actual.
And I think it might be helpful just for anybody who might be listening to this for the first time and hearing this information and these concepts, yes, for the first time. It's helpful for the human experience to label things so that we can talk and we
Yes,
can communicate
absolutely.
with
Yes,
each other.
of course. Yeah.
So, do we have a head and fingers as we're looking at them? Yes,
Mm, of
at a
course.
level. And as we're having conversations, sometimes it really helps to look at what's actually happening in the absolute as opposed to the relative that the human being experience.
Mm.
So just for people who might switch off now and say, well, of course we've got fingers. I'd like to just
Mm,
do you want to talk to that, Vince?
sure. Yeah. It's it's not that somebody who is awake is going to say, I don't have fingers. That's a youthful concept in terms of communication, in terms of describing what goes on. The difference is that the person who is awake is going to be very likely blown away by the quality of sensations that come in through these things we call fingers. They're going to go, oh, this is something else, right? Whereas the person who's not awake is going to go, well, I'm touching the tree. And if I say to them, what does it feel like? They might say, oh, it's cold or it's smooth or something like that. There are the labels again. Whereas the awake person is going to go, oh,
The beauty in the
and
moment.
I'm consumed by goosebumps again when we're just thinking about that. Right? They're going to be the awe of it. I call it the magic of existence is much more apparent to somebody who doesn't stop at the label of fingers and touch or even sensation. Right? So the labels are great for focusing our attention in a particular direction, but the words are never the thing, and labels are words, and so they stop you short of actual experience, or if there is experience, it's limited. So the idea of recognizing what is concept and what is actual is that the actual is mind-boggling. You cannot get your mind around it. So when we come back to that tree and we go, there's just this sensation when I touch it, or there's a sensation of smell, or there's a sensation of coolness because of the shade, or a relief from the heat that was outside of the shade. Right? There are these sensations that go on, but the awe that can be experienced in that is just mind blowing. So if we limit ourselves to the concept that it's a tree, that has use. That has use. If you're going into a nursery, you're going to buy a tree, you're going to say to the nurseryman, I want a tree of a certain kind. That's useful. But we're not talking about the useful nature of society as such. What we're talking about is the possibility to experience what is actual at a really fundamental level. And that's what happens when people wake up.
Now, can I ask you, Vince? So, and this is just so from what I can perceive, there are there are, and I know it's challenging to put things into stages, but I think there are stages. That there's the initial awakening or dropping of identity,
Hmm.
or that realization that you're not that identity, or looking at who you are. And then there's another level, which is a non-dual realization, where there's a collapse between you and I, and the distance.
Mm.
So when you're talking about when you're touching the tree, are you speaking through a non-dual experience? Are you
Uh,
living your non-dual, or are you just actually in the? Can you explain a little bit about that, please?
yeah, the non-dual experience is something that generally arrives later. When when so in the beginning, what you mentioned was that we recognise there's no self running the show, right? But that doesn't fall away completely instantly.
Yeah.
It might for some, it's possible, it certainly can happen, but the remnants of that will persist for a while. There are bits of identification that we're not aware of until they get triggered. And so
Mhm.
that's when I say it's a continuing path, is that we continue to discover remnants of identification that we didn't know were there until circumstances activates them. And then we go, oh, and there's an instant recognition that there's an identification with a self still there, even though we intellectually know and we mostly experience no self running the show. Those bits will come up when they are much more dissolved and we don't any longer get triggered into identification by desires or aversions. Ill will is often referred to as. The next step beyond that is where people start to appreciate how form is a product of thought. We create form with our thought. Now, this starts to sound pretty woo-wooish because it kind of it's beyond what most people have experienced with the initial shift. But when we recognize that we create form with our mind, that can have a pretty big effect on the way we see things. Not that it's a permanent situation either. It's just that it can be seen that way, and then we'll go back to the old way in order to navigate through the world. But essentially, that's just a recognition of how much our mind plays into this game. So we're getting kind of advanced, if you like. The next step after that is to recognize what's there. If there's no actual form, if form is a product of my mind, what's there when there's no form? So the formless becomes something to consider. Now that's an even bigger mind boggle to get you. You're not going to get your mind around those things. They can only be experienced.
And like some of the concepts you're talking about here are some of the, again, it's difficult to put the stages, but there are levels of deepening of
Yes,
experience.
yes, and that's what we're talking about here, much deeper level. Yeah.
And so
And it's at that formless level where we start to realize, or the form and the formless level, where we start to realize that things only exist because of my attention to them, but my attention is mine. It's my attention. Not when I say mine, that's a tricky one. When I say mine, I don't mean I own it. I mean,
yeah.
it originates from the same place as the attention originates from, and it's a creation of the attention. And that's when we recognize that there's no difference between us and anything or anybody else. So that is, again, you're not going to think about it. You can't get your mind around it. It can only be experienced. So people will have this experience where I am it and it is me.
No, I haven't heard anyone, everyone who I've listened to or watched over the period will always say our language doesn't support it. Our language, there is no language that can talk about the experience.
Yes. Yeah.
And what you are describing, though, of those sort of, when you're talking about the desire and the ill will, and then the perception, that can sort of follow a fetter model. So there is
Yeah.
what we call
Yeah.
head fetters,
Yeah.
and that breaking comes from Buddha, and the first fetter, if you like, is that identity. Seeing who
Yes.
you truly are.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, probably the first 8 fetters are about identity, but the first 5 are about at a grosser level of identity, right? And then we get then we get to 6, 7, and 8. It's a much more subtle levels of identity. They're the remnants that I was talking about. That. But when we get to say Feta 8, it talks about, well, Penilla, who I would always, lovely lady, I would see her as a mentor. She talks about the conceit of I am in Feta 8. So the conceit of I am is that, well, of course I exist, but it's, yeah, that's seen through. When that Feta falls, it is seen that I only exist as a thought. That's not even right, but that's kind of close
Right.
enough. Yeah,
I'll leave it. I've led you down a rabbit hole here, Vince.
yeah, yeah.
I'll sort of pull that back because that is a whole other level of experience. But if I could pull you back to your own awakening when it happened, you'd been that seeker for all that time, and then you had the awakening, and you went through LU, and it became your life. Um, would you ever turn back? Was there anything, or would you ever turn back and not do the seeking? And I know you can't, but
Yeah,
would
it's a
has that
crazy
thought ever
question.
passed your
Yeah.
head?
Yeah, are you asking me would I give up what life is, what I experience as life now? No, never, never. This is. Am I allowed to say this is fucking beautiful? Why would I
Yeah.
want anything else?
Of course you can. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think for listeners, it's just when I started looking at this, I was like, is this real? Or like
Another,
it's actually
another.
almost unbelievable. I'm like, are these people talking about can we actually achieve what we call, and anyone enlightened these days, and anyone who you talk to now who's gone through an awakening knows that this enlightenment is not an enlightenment as people
Yeah,
imagine.
that's
So
right. Yeah.
um
You'll hardly
uh,
ever hear me use that word enlightenment. It's like I don't know what it is. I
thoughts,
call
yeah.
waking up because it can describe something, or I'll accept liberation because that can describe something, that we've already talked about. But in actual fact, what I say is forget about spirituality. This is just being more fundamentally human.
Yeah,
It
I
it
like that.
is it is what we are when we remove the oppression of having to be a certain way. That's all. It's really simple. It's really simple.
A lot of people start off with that pointing, and just ask yourself, who am I? Who am I?
Yeah,
It's this
yeah.
one way of pointing. So, Vince, did you have what were the biggest challenges of this process for you? Because there is that
Challenges?
way. Yeah, were there challenges with integration of dropping those first fetters? How did you navigate life with your wife, with your kids? Did anything change? Were things different? How did you navigate?
Mm. Well, I would have to say the words again. The internal change was astounding. The internal change is astounding if I remember how it used to be, and that's getting a bit hard to do. But yeah, but externally, my friends don't know I'm awake. My wife thinks this is a load of rubbish. So,
Well,
on the outside, things appear much the same. But how can I share my appreciation for, if I say to my wife, "Oh, look at the colour of that flower! Isn't that amazing?" And I'm kind of melting with it. I'm vibrating with the intensity of that. And she goes, "Yeah, yeah, it's pretty. It's it's not shareable. It is just what it is. And when I first woke up, yeah, I wanted to wake up the whole world. I wanted everybody to get to it. Now, I have to admit, there's still a bit of that there, but there's also a lot more sensibility about the possibility of doing that. So now I recognise that you can only help people who ask for help. If they don't think there's anything wrong or whatever, you don't say anything to them. So all of the people in my social group where I live here have no idea about me being awake.
Okay.
Some of the closest friends know that I do this weird thing and have meetings with people, but they don't know what it's about, and they're not interested. They don't ask. Otherwise, I would share it with them, but they don't. So yeah, it just is the way it is. Yeah. Now, so problems with integration? No, there are no problems with that. There was, I guess, I could put a story around early days enthusiasm being a bit of a problem, but things have settled down and it's become very, very normal, very ordinary in a way. But I would hardly ever go through a day where I wouldn't be blown away by something I come across. You know, a classic is after walking the dog this morning, I was walking back up the road and I came across a pothole that just blew my mind away. Just the shape of the pothole, the edges of it. There was a rock sitting in the middle of it, and it was just beautiful and amazing. But I know it sounds crazy. I can imagine it sounds totally crazy to people, but look, I almost cried with telling you that. It was just so poignant. It was just something that happens to me all the time. You know, and yeah, anyway, there you go. It is what it is. Yeah.
A couple of things on that. Maybe backtrack a little bit because you did say, I can't remember exactly what you said, but you said something, after the initial awakening and how things, these realizations were coming up, and you also mentioned that, you can see the thoughts for what they are, and you can choose, you can say no, or if there's an inclination to go towards that thought, then you can accept it. When you say that inclination, how do you differentiate between ego and intuition? Because there'll be some sneaky shadow ego stuff in there.
Yeah,
Eh?
sure. Yeah,
How,
yeah, I get that.
how
Yeah.
do you?
Well, here's a good little story about it. So what I would refer to as ego is a kind of a self-aggrandizement, if
Yeah.
that's a word.
Oh, I like that.
Uh,
I like that. Yeah,
yeah.
I'll use
So
that one.
so this goes back some time, and I don't remember the actual incident, but I remember thinking, "Oh, I didn't get triggered by that. Isn't that good?" And it was like when I said, "Isn't that good?" I had this picture of myself patting myself on the shoulder. Oh, you got it, Vince. You got it. That's ego. That's
Yeah.
identification. That's ego. Yeah. Um, So I've forgotten what was the rest of the
No,
other
it
part of
was
your question.
it was just, how do you differentiate between ego
Oh,
and
and intuition.
intuition?
Yes, I remember now. Yeah, yeah. Um, it's a classic one to say, what is your gut saying? Now,
Yeah.
when you look at that, you become aware of something that is really difficult to describe. And if it presents itself to you as a thought, it will present itself as a possibility. It'll be a soft, gentle possibility, very likely with a question mark at the end of it. Whereas if it comes from the ego, it'll be definite, capitals underlined with an exclamation mark. And so there's a kind of a different experience of something that comes as intuition. And so you're learning to trust your intuition, and I say learning very, very specifically there because most people don't even recognize when intuition is working because they have placed well above that knowledge as important. So if you recognize that from the moment you go to kindergarten and people give praise, they'll be giving praise for being smart and they'll omit that for being not smart. And so we learn to put knowledge and information and memory up on a pedestal right from the very early days. So we've got a lifetime of conditioning with that stuff. And what I'm saying is that that has no place in awakening. That has no place in real life. It has a use, but it's a very limited use. So if you think about it this way, what comes from your intuition will be about a situation. What comes from your ego will be about you.
Mm. Mm.
So self-referential thoughts you might label as ego or self or identification. I actually dislike the word ego because 1,000 people have 1,000 different meanings for it, so it's never quite clear what it is. A bit like that with what enlightenment is. You know, everybody has a different idea about what enlightenment is. So those things are better not used, you know, generally speaking. It's like what reality is. I don't like the word reality particularly. I'd much rather say what is actual.
Yeah. And your experience right now. Yeah.
Mm, mm. Well,
I
that's the
think
only thing that's actual.
did you find when you said you noticed that as you were can we say deepening and your awakening that you might not be triggered by things. Was it your experience that you then went through a lot of shadow work? Did that present itself
No,
to you? No, you didn't. Okay.
no. And the story that I've got about that is that during that 45 years of seeking, I did a lot of
Yeah,
shadow work in a lot of
yeah,
ways. You know, I did
yeah.
I did all sorts of mostly alternative kind of things, but I did a lot of Gestalt therapy. I did
Oh.
encounter groups. I ended up running encounter groups. I did so much of that. You know, there was a 5-year period in my life where I was a hypnotherapist, so I was very much into the unconscious mind and that kind of stuff. So
Mhm.
45 years of seeking was also 45 years of exposing a lot of that shadow work. So when it happened, no, there wasn't much of it. But some of the things that I've discovered recently, or more recently, that have been triggered, certainly I could call that shadow work. Um, I recognise probably one of the most recent ones, a good example, is where I recognised, well, a situation occurred and I found myself feeling annoyed at somebody. And I was annoyed because on the outside, it was because they were exhibiting what I considered to be, I don't know how to put it, stupid. Anyway, all right, the actual situation was I was parked in a driveway doing some work. And in a duplex in a house that was two houses together, and I was parked in the other person's driveway. And she came out and asked me to move my car, which I thought was perfectly reasonable. I thought she must have wanted to get her car out of the driveway, out of the garage and get out because mine was in the road. And I moved my car and nothing happened. She didn't come out. And I eventually went, "You bitch, you just wanted me to move because it was your driveway. You didn't want to get out. There was no practical reason. You were expressing some ownership bullshit." Right? And that annoyance was there. And when I investigated it, I came across this belief I had that had been a bit hidden, that the world should be the way I think it should be. She should be the way I think she should be. Everybody in the world should be the way I think they should be. And of course, you say something like that, all you can do is crack up laughing because it's so ridiculous, you know.
Yeah.
But there it was, you know. And so I thought that that was a good one. That was a bit of shadow work that I revealed, but I only saw it as a belief. Right there was then, but then it was probably a couple of months later, something else happened, and I don't actually remember what it was, but again I got triggered, and this time I went a lot deeper in looking for what was going on, and whether I manufactured it or whether it was a real memory, all memories are a fabrication, but whether it actually happened or not, I don't know. But I had this image of myself as a 3, 4, 5 year old, somewhere very young, standing in front of the fridge, hands on hips, stamping my foot, saying, "I want ice cream." And I was telling my mother to get ice cream out of the freezer for me because it was up top, I think, probably, I don't know. Anyway, um, and what I realized was that I believed that wanting to the point where I demanded was enough for me to get things. That me wanting things was an actual, had power.
Yeah.
Now that particular one hasn't come up again since then. I just, you know, that might be how we call shadow work, something that's been embedded in there for a long time. Um, and it revealed itself, and now I feel much more. This is a tricky one. I feel more accepting of Donald Trump and his idiot performance. You know, it's whereas before that I was getting quite angry at the idea of what he was doing to the world and to America and so on. Um, I used to get very angry at what was happening in Gaza or Ukraine. Right? Even though I could see that they weren't affecting me personally directly, that my story about them was that they were wrong, you know, and that power that was in me wanting that to be different should be enough to change it. Well, of course, that's not going to happen, and that was crazy. So these days, it's not to say that I'm content with that situation, but I'm accepting of that situation. It is the way it is, and
You're not
I still think it's wrong, but I don't have that anger anymore that I used to have when about it. Yeah. So I don't know if that's clear enough, but that's
Yeah,
yeah.
it is. But I think that the reason I was asking was I think you may have been in a unique situation where you'd done a lot of that personal development first before that initial awakening.
Yes.
I think that might be different for other people who may
Oh,
not
sure. Yeah.
have that amount of personal development. And then all of a sudden they're because that shadow work is well for me it's the stickiness to the identity.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
so for me, one was around, significance, and I was holding on to that, and I didn't know that I was holding on to it. I had to dig deep, deep, deep. What is still holding on here? What it is, and I would see these little things would come up, and um, it wasn't until I could let go of I did these things, I achieved that, I made
Yes.
these achievements
Yeah.
all wrapped around my identity and my voids. So it wasn't until all that sort of stuff presented itself could I actually see it for what it was and let it go. And I think that might be the case for a lot of people.
Sure.
All these
Sure.
attachments
And
to the identity we don't know we have.
for some people, well, in fact, for more than some, probably I wouldn't say a lot, but for a significant number of people, they will go through a, a painful a painful part of the realizing,
Yeah.
giving up. See, it's this is crazy. It's not that there was ever an actual self running the show. but the belief in itself provided a lot of people with a sense of security or a sense of control. Control is a really, really big one. And so in that intermediate stage where they're recognizing that they never ever actually had control, there is still the feeling that they're giving up control. And that can be really frightening for some people. You know, they can feel like without that control, things can go very wrong. And that concern can mean that people suffer severely at that point. So this, yes, I mean, it's good of you to bring this up. It's most important to realize that you've got to be pretty sure that you want this stuff because it's like you're going to go through some stuff to get there. It's not a free ride, so to speak. Uh,
And why do you think there's this? Why do you think there's so many people waking up at this time in the world?
yeah, good question. And it's definitely an issue. I mean, at Liberation Unleashed, um, I've seen 20, 30 people lined up waiting for a guide to come along and help them. At the moment, there's not. There's only one or two there. But um, mind you, that's because I'm working with 10 people at the moment, and I know Stacey's working with probably about 8 people and so on. So there's more guides as well. So but there is a lot constantly. So the number of people that have gone through Liberation Unleashed, which would be a very small fraction of the people in the world who are looking at the
Waking up.
idea of waking up, thousands have gone through there. Thousands. In the time that I've been with them, there would be definitely a couple of thousand people who have gone through it. I would say the internet is one of the really, really big things. So when I was a seeker, back in 2011, which doesn't sound like that long ago, um, the internet was still in its infancy. There was no YouTube, or at least if there was, I didn't know about it. So these days, of course, you can get thousands of people on YouTube talking about this stuff, and there's all the other social media things that people post things on about it as well. And then there's places, but POK, the Perfectly OK group is amazing. They have something like 80 meetings every week, and there
Wow.
are literally 3,000 people that go to those things.
Wow.
Some are also at others as well. Um, so there is a lot going on. There's a lot. I mean, we all know about Alan Watts. You know, he was probably one of the very, very first people. A lot of his early videos are in black and white. They're that early, you know. Um, so he really brought a lot of this stuff from the east to the west, right? But it grew. It grew after that. And then you get the likes of Oprah and Deepak Chopra and various other well-known people, you know, who do. Eckhart Tolle, he introduced a huge number of people to this kind of thing. So, but a big part of it, so a part of my seeking just before I woke up was going to some non-dual meetings. And one of the really big things I got out of that was the what's the right word? The belief, the recognition, uh, I guess it was a belief that ordinary people can get enlightened. That's what I thought at the time, but now I say wake up. Just, once upon a time it was like only dedicated people who went to India and lived in
Yeah.
a cave could do this kind of thing. And even the Indians had it so that they were essentially, it was after retirement that people went off by themselves to seek enlightenment. Um, and it was very rare for a householder, this is the way the Indians used to put it, for a householder to wake up or to get enlightened. That didn't happen very often because they had other duties that got in the road, and it takes 100% dedication to do that. Well, they were myths. They were propagated in contemporary Zen literature about the dedication that was required, and only a certain people could get there, and only if they deserved it and lived a perfect life. They were celibate or whatever requirements that were there. Well, it turns out it's all bullshit, total
Mm.
bullshit. You know, the reality is it's there for anybody and everybody to do that. And when enough people are awake, and certainly we're still very much a minority in the world, but when enough people are awake, our education system will change. We won't be putting knowledge or information up on the pedestal that we once did. It will take a useful place, but it won't be the be all and end all of everything. You know, it won't be you have to go to university and acquire a huge amount of knowledge in order to be a professional. All that kind of stuff will change. So it's a tricky one, but I think that the availability of guides is a huge thing, and the fact that people are starting to recognize it as a real thing, and the fact that it is possible for everybody is behind the growth of it. And oh boy, it is growing at a phenomenal rate. Yeah.
I think for me, it was just YouTube, and then and again, it was cracking that first belief: is this possible for me in
Yes.
this lifetime? Can I do this as me? And
Yes.
when there's so much evidence of that from credible people, that belief gets chipped away a bit, and then you're like, oh, wait a minute, then what do I do? What do I do to start that? Now,
Mm.
as I say, your group helped me, Vince, and then also LU, which was through you. And just for people listening, LU Liberation Unleashed is a place where people can get guidance for free. You don't have to pay
Yep.
for that.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah.
You can go on there and register, and a guide will come and we'll do some direct pointing, just to
Yes.
get you over
Yeah.
that first fetter or that first awakening around identity,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you're so aligned to that or you feel like that. But also, Vince, you run your group and you run meetings, is it 4 times a week?
Yep. Yeah.
So can you tell us then, because who's the group for? Who's it for? What's its purpose?
Well, maybe if I tell you how it came into being.
That
So
would be great.
with Liberation Unleashed, and just by the way, that's liberationunleashed.com to if you want to go there. But that's their focus very much on what when we put it in the feta terms of the first feta, right? Or the first and second feta, which is doubt. So they're really interested in seeing through the delusion that there's an actual self there running the show. And so that's it. So the Buddhists would call that stream entry. And so in a sense, that's what they do, stream entry. And the what I saw as a problem was that after people got stream entry, after they'd seen through that delusion and it just became an illusion, and they had that first shift, they were kind of abandoned. You know, there was a Facebook group that they were invited to join where other people who had been through, but it was never very active. So what I imagined happened is that a lot of people just went back to sleep. Their old habits just kicked back in and away they just went back to the way they were. Maybe they were slightly improved, maybe they didn't suffer as much, but essentially they didn't keep going on the path, so to speak. So to find some of the deeper realizations and move towards some of the stuff we talked about earlier when we get up to the higher fetters. Um, so my initial motivation for starting the group was to give these people that have gone through the gate somewhere where they could talk to other people who'd gone through the gate. Because my own experience was that you finish Liberation Unleashed and you go home, and who are you going to talk to? You can't talk to your family about it. You can't talk to your friends about it. They've got no idea where you're coming from or what you're talking about. So simply to be able to talk to other people who thought like you, who had this experience, was going to be a really good support. And I often, when I was guiding somebody when they had gone through the gate, I frequently would recommend if I thought saw them as having if they were lucid enough is the way I put it is that I would recommend that they started guiding because that would keep them in the loop and that would give them the opportunity to deepen. So they were helping other people, they were paying it forward. What they got for free, they were paying forward, and the consequence was that they were keeping it alive. And so, the groups and doing that was really, I thought, really, really important. But it turned out, really weirdly, it turned out, not weirdly, it turned out that straight away after the group started and people would start talking to each other, I got all this amazing feedback about the value of doing that. And here we are a couple of years later since I started those groups, and I still get constant feedback from people about how great it is to even some people on my mailing list don't ever attend the groups, but they watch the videos afterwards, and you'll see comments on the YouTube channel where all those videos are saying, oh, that was great, oh, that was really good, or oh, I really identified with that, and so on and so on. So a video that I put up can easily have 80 or 100 views by other people. Um, and yet only 5 people have turned up to the group, or 10 or 20 people have turned up to the group. So, yeah. Um, so the idea is for that. And I want it to spread, not because I want more work, but because uh, I think the more people that are awake, the better place this world will be. Um, that's a big one. Yeah.
And you do them in different days and different time zones as well then, so that you've got some
Yes,
that
yes.
everybody can engage. But what I
Yeah.
noticed, Vince, is you've got people in the group though who have been through the gate, who might have moved on to all different stages of deep realization, but you've also got people who are just exploring it and who haven't gone through the gate.
Yes, yeah. Look, I'm happy for anybody
Now
to come
you've
along
got
if they're interested.
anybody,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
They can be
Um,
seekers. That's fine. I'll help a seeker wake up if it's possible. Um, and there are other people that come along to the groups that also are guides and who are quite happy to chip in and help those people. And it's great. I mean, one other guide, Marius,
it's
he's a
great.
great
Mm.
friend, and he balances me beautifully. I waffle on with all this woo-woo stuff, and he kind of comes back to earth really quick. So it's good stuff. There's a great balance. There's what I call hive wisdom that happens in the groups, because even people who have not woken up don't realise that out of their mouth comes stuff that's really awake. They just because they're so relaxed and so spontaneous and authentic, they get in touch with stuff that they don't even know is there. Yeah,
Yeah,
the groups are great.
I find it refreshing, to go in there sometimes and just there's always something that you're going to resonate with. There
Yeah,
might be a doubt or a realization or a perspective or a question.
yeah.
I think I said earlier, like last week when I was on your group, the one thing was all we have is what we're going through right now. And just that one comment from you changed it changed the focus of everybody because everybody dropped into the now. And the
Hmm.
conversation shifted just with that one conversation, which is fantastic. But I
Yeah,
think it is important, these groups again, they're for free. People can join them up. We
yep,
can
yep,
join
yep,
us. I'll put all your details below on this YouTube and
yep,
link, Vince, the link to register and also for LU. I put my hand up to be a guide and myself through
oh,
you.
great. Yep, yep.
So
Good one. Yeah.
I'll put all that information down. So what advice then? What advice or steps would you give? So for anyone who's listened this far, must have an interest somehow in awakening, right, or deepening the realization. For someone who, might think, okay, well, I'm interested in exploring this. What advice would you give to the new seeker?
Hmm. Well, probably say go to LU, go to Liberation Unleashed as a good beginning step. I mean, there's lots of things come to mind. I'd say watching countless YouTube videos. Try to consider whether or not they're actually changing your experience or whether or not you're just getting high watching them. And if you're just getting high, you need help to go beyond that. So having a guide to help you is really valuable. We fool ourselves too easily. We get in the rut of our old perception, and so we don't discover new stuff. And what this is about is discovering new stuff or discovering a different perspective on it. So having a guide is good value. But appreciate that the guides at Liberation Unleashed are not charging, they're doing it for free, they're giving up their time. And you know, if people I'm guiding at LU, I can spend an hour every single day on one person. So you can imagine, you know, luckily the 10 people that I'm guiding at the moment is that they kind of share their, I don't insist that they do it every day. So consequently, I might have 2 or 3 or 4 to do each night with. And because I've been doing it for a long time, I do a lot of copying and pasting, so I can kind of get the time down a little bit to do that. Because I've said what I've been saying for 14 years now, so a lot of those things are just repetitions of, you know. And I use a chatbot that I developed for help as well these days, and that certainly makes a big difference. So I've got a website, and I which I developed over a long period of time, and certainly it needs a lot more work. But what I did was I made a PDF of the website, and then I fed that to the chatbot, and I trained the chatbot on that as its knowledge base. And so
Beautiful.
now that's a useful tool for, you know, it'll quickly show me what people are saying and so on. So that kind of can save me a lot of time as well. Um, Yeah. So, but yeah, look, so, and of course, there's a huge variety in the YouTube stuff that's out there as well. Um, and I'm not saying that this is the only path or Liberation Unleashed is the only way to go about this. People will go to non-duality YouTubes and they will wake up from that. Most don't, but a lot. I don't. I shouldn't say that. I don't really know how many do wake up, but you can just be careful. I mean, I recognise that when I was a seeker, I was, for example, one of the things I did was I listened to the Jed McKenna audio books again and again, and they didn't help me wake up. Well, I didn't wake up from listening to them, but I got high on them every time. And I do recognise that that was a big deal. I was just made me feel good to watch those things. Right. So back then, I was fully identified as a seeker, and a seeker, of course, is a good person, a spiritual person. And so that was part of my identity thing. You know, it was a big deal to be identified as a seeker. Um, but it was only after that, leaving all that stuff behind, when I recognised that I couldn't be a seeker and be awake at the same time, that it
Last
happened for me. Yeah.
I could often be the last thread. I think YouTube for me, it really did help me just to again break through the belief of what was possible,
Yeah.
uh, and also gave me a sort of afterwards and looking at some, I'm like, oh, so this must be the shadow work that we're talking about, or oh, this must be this that I thought might. So it was actually good for me to get a preemptive stages after that. But I
Yes.
think initial awakening that comes to the direct self-inquiry.
Yeah.
Um, so,
So when if I mentor other guides as well, and what I say to other guides is always good guiding is where you ask a question that isn't seeking an answer, but rather is helping somebody have a discovery as they contemplate the question. So what we want is to help people to discover stuff, and then it's a visceral, experiential happening. It's not just an intellectual transfer of knowledge, which is useless.
yeah.
You've already got a head full of knowledge. We don't need it anymore. And so when you're watching YouTube videos, I'm just talking to the people in general now. When you're watching YouTube videos, if you're not making discoveries, forget it. You're wasting your time. It's got to be about what you discover about yourself.
Yep. So Vince, thank you for sharing everything today. I'm sure we could deep dive on any one of those aspects we talked about today. We could make a series, which I'd actually like to do. I'd like to interview you again, if you're open to that.
Sure.
Um, I love hearing your perspectives. You can tell, it comes from deep experience and understanding. And I just love how you're so open with the guiding and the sharing and getting other people to do the same. And because we want to,
Yeah, yeah,
it's
those that want to, of course. Yeah.
fantastic. But if you could go back to your past self before the awakening, and you could give yourself one little whisper, what would it be?
What came up when you asked that question was enjoy.
Beautiful.
Just enjoy. Yeah,
Enjoy life.
yeah, we could go on about that, but if you're not enjoying life, there's something wrong. Yeah.
Vince, thank you very much.